Hello and welcome to the Innovation Women Speak webinar series. My name is Bobbie Carlton. I'm the founder of Innovation Women. If you're not familiar with Innovation Women, we are a visibility bureau for entrepreneurial and technical and professional women. We connect female speakers with speaking opportunities, and we connect event managers with speakers. Our mission is to help women build their brand and advance their careers while eliminating those terrible all-male panels. We are tired of seeing the all-male, all-pale, and all-stale panels. We want to see new voices on stage. So unlike a traditional speakers bureau, when you join Innovation Women, you get all this. You get social media amplification, speaking invitations, a weekly email with a list of over 100 calls for speakers that you can apply for. Event managers invite you directly from our platform, as well as we promote what you do. We've also got a lot of resources, and if you are one of our either event managers, our speakers, or just one of our buddies, if you haven't been to our new website, you should go and check it out. We just pushed that live a few days ago. So today we've got one of our Innovation Women speakers on deck, and if you want to be one of our webinar speakers, you'd want to join Innovation Women. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter to get more information. You can go to our website, and we also have a special for our webinar attendees. We're offering 20% off your first year. If you take advantage of the special, you can do that until midnight tonight. The membership will cost you just about the same as buying a Grand Cafe Latte at Starbucks for just 22 days out of the year. So, gotta love the math, advanced math there. We'll be pushing out that special code again during the webinar for your convenience, but all you have to do is do IW webinar until midnight tonight, and that's in all capital letters. And before we go on to today's speaker, I'd like to give a plug to our next speaker in the webinar series, and this will be 2 weeks from today. On May 1st, we're excited to feature Melissa Fields-Jerkovic. Jerkovic. Melissa will be talking about how she pronounces her last name, as well as how she got her CTO to pay for open APIs because of the opportunity it presented in increasing reach and revenue for her company. In order to convince C-level executives that there is an opportunity worth investing in, it's sometimes necessary to charge forward and create the outcome you need them to see. I'm personally really looking forward to that one. We'll push out the link to that registration at the end of today's webinar. And lastly, I'd like to review some logistics, which will help you have the best experience today. What you see here is an annotated version of your screen. Below the video viewing window, there are some tabs. The default tab is for asking questions. You can type in a question at any time during the program, and we'll be answering those. The Vote tab is where you'll see the polls that we're going to be asking, so we can learn more about you. The tab called Rate This enables you to rate the webinar and provide us with feedback. We do read all of the feedback there and adjust things when we have suggestions from our listeners. And if at any time you need audio help, just feel free to click on the Help button at the bottom of the screen. You also have the ability to enlarge your screen to view it full screen. So now on to today's presentation. We're delighted to have Andrea Goulet with us today. Andrea is the CEO of Corgi Bytes, a software development shop dedicated to maintaining and modernizing software applications. She's also the founder of LegacyCode.rocks, a community and podcast dedicated to changing the way we think about legacy code. And she's also been named by LinkedIn as one of the top 10 professionals in software under 35. I'm going to be chatting with Andrea today to discuss what good communication has to do with building software. Ta-da.
Yay.
Yeah. Hello. Welcome to Innovation Women Speaks, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Bobbie. So I love this. And yeah, a shout out for all of the benefits that you provide. That email with all of the calls for proposals, that is gold. I love it. So yeah, it's totally worth it.
We've heard that a few times. We have a person that spends time actually collecting all of that.
Yeah, it's great stuff. It's great stuff. So great.
So I think one of the things that we're going to do is kind of start off with the polls, right?
Yeah. I have a couple of things just to ask, about kind of how confident people feel in their communication skills and then how confident people feel in their technical skills. I've noticed that people tend to kind of favor one or the other, and then they feel really nervous about moving into that other realm. So, so just setting up a poll real quick. And then also my information is on the screen. So that's my Twitter and LinkedIn and website. So if anybody wanted to get in touch after the webinar, that's how to get in touch with me.
Fabulous. So one of the things, if people want to tell us in the feedback from the audience, they can talk to us right from that feedback tab, and they can tell us, how confident do you feel in your technical skills, and how confident do you feel in your communication skills? Yeah. So, I think I always tell people it's like I'm a communicator, I'm a marketer, and I think a lot of technical people get very nervous about those communication skills.
Yeah, 100%. My background is in marketing and communication as well. And when I was presented with the opportunity to move into software, I felt massive imposter syndrome. And I just felt like, oh, well, I'm not good at this technical stuff because, there's people who do this. And what I found was that it's the overlap, and that, a lot of engineers that I've met feel the same way about their communication skills. They're nervous about speaking. They're nervous about saying, what they think. And so there's a lot that we all have to learn from each other.
Absolutely. So you have that background in marketing and strategic communications. How did you end up in software?
Yeah, it's a fun story. So I was, I got my degree in marketing. I worked as a copywriter for years. I worked as a consultant with small businesses. And at my high school reunion, my friend, Scott, came up to me and said, I have this startup, but I don't have any clue how to do marketing and business. And I have a really good idea of how I want to build software. I understand that inside and out, but I need someone who can take my ideas and bring them to the marketplace. And he had been reading my blog and said, I think you're the perfect person for this. And I was like, Scott, I don't code. I don't know what you're I think that you need someone else. And he goes, no. Reading your blog, you are a software developer and you don't even know it. He said, because the way you think about software or the way you think about communications, like I was talking about audience segmentation and I was talking about how to use variables for hyper-localization and all these like pretty technical things. And he said, that's the same thing you do in software. It's just the words are a little bit different. And he said, I believe in you 100%. And he said, besides, I've been doing this for a year and it's going nowhere. And then he said, I'd rather have 49% of something amazing than 100% of nothing. And so either you join my startup or I'm kind of decided that I'm going to fold. And I was like, oh, well, so it took a few months to kind of decided, yeah, this might be a good fit. And then 3 years later, we actually got married. So it's been a wonderful partnership. And I've learned so much along the way.
That's great. So the projects that you work in are often referred to as legacy code. What does that mean?
Yeah, so legacy code, the way I define it is code without trust. You don't trust the system. You don't trust the code. You don't trust the people on your team. You don't trust the documentation. There are a lot of different kind of definitions, but in general, it's the code that's kind of like a little outdated. It's harder to work with, and to me, it really boils down to trust and to good communication. And so what we discovered was that by applying really, really, really good communication to a lot of these projects, that's where you make traction. A lot of these projects end up in a legacy state just as much because of the communication as it is the technology. I would argue even more so. So I found that kind of in this place, Scott's passion is around modernizing legacy code. We were watching an episode of This Old House, and he goes, I want to do that. He said he saw the level of craft and the amount of dedication, and he's like, I want to take software that is really useful but needs to be modernized and apply that same level of care and passion and craft to modernizing them. And so my marketing background was like, oh, well, that's a perfect product market fit, because there's a lot of software out there, and there's a lot of, there's not very many people who love doing this, so we could actually make a go at it. And so I thought, I was originally going to be just the face of the company and kind of the marketing and business person, but, I learned how to code right alongside Scott and discovered that these communication skills are critical to maintaining and modernizing software.
Does that mean we should be calling you Norm?
I guess you can. Yeah, we call Scott Bob sometimes. So, but yeah, I like Norm. He's nice. So, yeah.
It's like Norm is awesome.
Yeah, and I think, what I love about that show is that you can tell that they're passionate about it, right?
Yeah.
Like you can, and I think that's what we bring with Corgi is that we wanted to create a place where the people who absolutely love doing this type of work can thrive. Because what we saw a lot, especially when we were starting to roll out in the early days, was people would roll their eyes and they're like, yeah, nobody actually really loves doing that work. And we're like, no, we promise, it brings us a lot of joy. And I think when you have that passion and when you have that feeling that you're doing something valuable, and when you go home at the end of the day and said, wow, I made the world a little bit better because of the work that I did, that's a really powerful feeling. And yeah, not everyone's going to feel that way. A lot of software developers enjoy kind of the early phases of a project, but for all the people on our team, it's the cleaning up, it's the remodeling that we love.
Neat. So your organization focuses on software maintenance and modernization. What do you think makes a code base healthy?
Yeah, so there's kind of three things. Stable, scalable, and secure. Of course, me being a copywriter, I was really happy that these ended up being alliterative. But, just to kind of break those down a little bit, stability is, the code base performs as you expect it. I think all of us have had, I find this a lot on, government websites, but it's like it crashes, or you have to do something weird, or you have to click this button over here, but it wasn't really useful. But it's like it performs as you expect, right? There's no crashes, things are relatively zippy, they're waiting around, just kind of performs as expected. There's also minimal bugs. So, every system is going to have bugs, but, there are some systems that are just way more buggy than others. One of the reasons that originally, when I was working with Scott, I thought maybe I could be a copywriter who specialized in error messages, because there are so many out there that are just so bad. And so we never want to get those. And when we do get an error message, we want it to be useful and actually tell us what to do. And then also, the big thing is that you can change it without it breaking. And this is where, we come in a lot, because what we find is that people say, my code base works, but I'm afraid to touch it because it's so brittle that if I make a change, it could bring the whole system down. And businesses change, needs change, users' demands change. So you have to have a stable code base that you're able to change. And so getting it to that point is important.
That's neat.
Yeah. It's also important for code to scale, right? So, most software runs businesses. And so hopefully you're getting more clients, right? You're getting more people who are using your software. And where the term that's used in the software space is concurrent users. So it might be that only 600 people can be on your platform at once. Well, that's going to really limit your growth if you get featured in a big thing and a lot of people sign up. And then that can cause people to leave or write a negative review. So being able to grow and adapt to meet the business demands is another thing that marks a code base as healthy. And then finally, security, right? This is a huge, huge issue. So we want to make sure that any sensitive information, whether that's about your customers or, their information, but, any sensitive information about your company, we want to make sure all of that is encrypted so that it makes it more difficult for people to hack into it. And then also, there's a lot of times, there's just updates. So similar to how you have to update your iPhone or your mobile phone, you have to update your software, and there are, security patches and things like that. And if those go ignored, it can present a real risk to your system. So a lot of this is kind of the, I call it maintenance because it's the equivalent of taking your car to get it, change the oil every, 3 months or so. There are just certain things that you need to do to your code base regularly to keep it healthy. And so, the mark of something that's healthy is it's stable, it can grow, it's scalable, and it's also secure.
Neat. Very cool. So you've referred to your work as software anthropology. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So software, software archaeology or anthropology. I am a huge nerd when it comes to history and civilizations. I just think there's so much interesting stuff there. And I'm a big fan of the great courses. I love just taking lectures, and I took a class on archaeology and one on anthropology. And, really what that is the study of the people who came before us. And it's trying to reconstruct what were they thinking? What was their culture like? What were their goals? What were their beliefs? And when we dive into a legacy code base, a lot of times these are older systems, sometimes not too old, maybe, 5, 10 years, but sometimes older. And the developers who originally built them aren't around. They've moved, or they've, gone on to start their own companies, but we sometimes don't have access to being able to talk to them one-on-one. So we rely a lot on these, kind of archaeological principles or anthropological principles. And so, one of those is, looking at the different artifacts that are left behind. So this is one of the things that I teach to engineers is how do you leave artifacts of your thinking? Because as a copywriter, this was something that was a skill that I had to learn, because I would, come up with these 6, 7-word taglines a lot of the time. And it wasn't the tagline itself that would get, sold. I had to justify why it would be used. But I had to write up a few paragraphs usually of a rationale of here's why and here's the research I did and things like that. So this is a skill that I learned, was how to leave artifacts of my thinking behind so that other people who were coming after me would know what I was thinking, even if I wasn't available.
So
and
what are
that's something,
those artifacts?
yeah.
So
Yeah,
what do those
so
artifacts look like?
So in the code base, there's a ton of different things. There's some stuff that's in the code. There's some stuff that's out. Sometimes like you can think of it in terms of synchronous and asynchronous, or obvious and not obvious. But you can, you can do a bunch of different axes. We did this with a Post-it note exercise that I was at a user group in London, and we kind of filled this in. But, just thinking through, some of the synchronous events. So synchronous is like, the people who are watching the webinar right now, like you and I, we're having this conversation. It's happening at the same time. For the people who watch the webinar a week from now, that's an asynchronous event. So there's meetings, there's videos, there's phone calls, but then there's things that aren't so obvious. Eye contact, body language, punctuality, like you show up for meetings on time. And those are all things that, people use to kind of get a sense of your presence and, your communication. And those are things that when I talk to engineers about, they're like, oh, I never thought of that. And then on the other side, we've got, the emails, right? We've got documentation, we've got text messages, Twitter. Slack is something that we use. We use Slack at Core Bytes and have for years. You've got user forums like Stack Overflow. But then you also have the code itself. Like, people sometimes think that the code is more for the machines, but we need to remember that other people are going to be reading this. So making sure that the code that you're writing is really easy to read. How do you name different things? So just like in the communication world, like I would name a variable. Like if I wanted to pull in a field from a database, right, it would be like first name, right? And the way that you name that actually matters, because when you're thinking through, if I just named it like FN, it might not make sense to somebody else who's going to use that template later. Same exact principle applies when we're building out software, because a lot of times you're interacting with a database, or you're interacting with different objects within a software system. And so the way you name that is so critical. Of course, error messages, which are like my thing. And then there's some more technical things. So, the way that we write out a scenario for how we might want to build a feature, or test that something is available. A pull request is basically saying, hey, I want somebody else to review this piece of work. And so that commenting and that back and forth. And then I even argue that timesheets, and I always get eye rolls when I say this, but I'm like, our clients actually a lot of times use that information. So if you just, say very quickly what you did, it doesn't have to necessarily take a lot of time, but that can be a really good way to leave an artifact about what you're thinking, so then that way people don't bug you later. And this is just scratching the surface. There's a whole lot more that you can dive into too.
Yeah, you mentioned software programming languages are designed more for humans than machines. I mean, can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. When I first started getting into software, I told myself, like, software is the white boys club. Like, I remember going to my very first conference. I was one of 2 women who was there, just in the audience, not even on stage. And it was so jarring. And I was like, there's no one who looks like me who really is involved in software. But little did I know that actually some of the biggest thinkers in software have been women. And so as I started to learn a little bit more about the history, I started to realize the best people in software, and some of the people who have made the biggest strides, have focused on making it a more seamless experience, and it's a more human experience. So yes, we are programming machines, but at the end of the day, we're doing this so that people can work with us. So, Two examples. The first is Ada Lovelace, who was the very first computer programmer in 1843. Like, this blew me away when I learned about this. And so her story is that she was the daughter of Lord Byron, and she was taking a tour of a factory. She grew up in England in the Industrial Revolution, and this factory was using punch cards to create these really elaborate fabrics, like so it's called the jacquard loom. So if you've ever seen like a jacquard pattern. And she was like, oh, she got really inspired and said, ones and zeros, ons and offs. You don't have to apply this just to looms. You could use this for math, for music, for pictures. And she was working with a gentleman named Charles Babbage, who was building a machine, called it the analytical engine. And she did a lot of the work to actually program that. So he built kind of the hardware, and she focused on the software and had these really detailed notes. And so one of the things she talked about is, that this engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or intent. And she called herself a poet. Like she really took that after her father, and she embraced that. So thinking, realizing that from the very beginning, the very, very first computer programmer was thinking about people, was thinking about not how this machine would work on the, yes, I mean, there was like on the, hardware and kind of the technical level, but really expanding that to why would somebody use this? Originally, Charles Babbage said, oh, this would only be useful for arithmetic. And she goes, no, 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 no. It could be used for all these and other things. And so another person who really inspired me was Grace Hopper. She was a rear admiral in the Navy in the late 40s and 50s through the 1980s. And what I love about her is that she goes, you know what, ones and zeros are great, but humans don't think in ones and zeros. Humans think in words. We think in things like print, right? If we want a computer to do something, wouldn't it be great if we could just type in an English word? And so she pioneered an English-like programming language called COBOL. And, some people have probably heard about this. This still runs a lot of the, our software today. This is an incredibly influential language. And this is called a compiled language because you write something like print, right? You write a function, and then it compiles down to the ones and zeros. So from the human's point of view, you're not actually writing out the ones and zeros. You're writing in the form of human speak. And almost all of the computer programs and computer languages that we use today are compiled languages, right? We do not write in ones and zeros. And so my argument there is that we are writing for humans. And that human may be somebody on your team. It may be a developer who comes after you've left. And it could even be your future self. But recognizing that, yes, you need to get it to work. You need to get it, to compile and have all the right ones and zeros. But the way that you structure your code base is much more targeted to a human being able to interact with that code than it is a machine. Grace Hopper also was the person who coined the term bug because she found a moth in the machine. And so that name kind of stuck. So.
That's cool. You don't like the term non-technical. Let's talk about that and what should we use instead?
Yeah. So the story behind this is that Scott and I had first, we had been in business for about 5 years, and we were on a road trip, and Scott had just been on a podcast. And I was like, oh, well, let's listen to your podcast. This is so exciting. So we had been working together about 5-6 years at this point. And at the end of the podcast, the guest, the host asked about Scott's origin story, and he said, oh, yeah, Andrea, she's great. I brought her on. She's great at, she's non-technical, but she's great at all the sales and marketing and the business stuff. And I remember sitting there in the car and hearing him call me non-technical, I got really upset. I was so angry. And Scott is very, very calm and just listened to me rant. But I said, you know, when am I going to be good enough in your eyes? Yeah, I think it kind of helped that we were married at this point because I could just kind of like go full out and say how I felt. But I said, when am I going to be technical in your eyes? When am I going to be good enough for you? Do I have to take a class? Is there some kind of certification that I need? I've been sitting down right next to you, coding for, you know, years, and yet I'm still not good enough for you. Like, what's it going to take? And so Scott, like, listened to me and said, you know, my mom is, you know, I'm way more technical than my mom, and like all this stuff. He sat there and listened and then took a deep breath, and he said, well, all I did was use the same word that you use to describe yourself in pretty much every meeting. So once you start calling yourself technical, I'm going to follow suit. And that moment really crystallized a lot of things for me, because I said, why? It was on me. It wasn't the rest of the world. Why couldn't I call myself technical? And that actually caused kind of a lot of soul searching as to why I felt this imposter syndrome and why I had such a fixed mindset. So I came back and I said, you know what, I started kind of observing why I started calling myself non-technical. And I realized that at a lot of conferences, people just asked me flat out. They said, you know, oh, are you technical or non-technical? And I felt like I had to force myself into one bucket or another. And a lot of times people, you know, I'm very few women at software conferences. People would assume I was a recruiter. And when I asked Scott, I was like, do people ever ask you this? He goes, no. And so I haven't done enough research to know whether or not this is a gendered term, but I assume that it is, based on my experience. So I started calling people out and saying, you know, does it have to be one or the other? Because what I hear non-technical, you know, and really when we dissect that, it means that that person has zero technical ability. And that's just impossible in today's day and age. No one who is in the modern workforce is non-technical. You know, even people who don't interact with technology on a regular basis, you know, typically have to, you know, fill in a punch card or, you know, like take orders, or like there is some element of technology that runs everything. So to say that somebody has zero technical ability is just false. So then recognizing, like, what can we use instead? So for me, it was a hard leap to say I'm technical, right? Like I felt, I don't know, like that I wasn't there yet. But I was like, there has to be something in the middle between either you're 100% on or you're zero. And so I started saying, you know, I'm less technical than the other people on my team, but I can hold my own and I can code, and, you know, I'm constantly learning more. And people were like, oh, okay. Because what I found people wanted when they asked me that question was, should I, you know, should I make my conversation really generic, or is it okay for me to talk on a deeper level about some of the stuff that I'm working on? And so it's usually just kind of a heuristic for kind of trying to gauge somebody else's, you know, how to proceed with a conversation. So, you know, there are other ways that you can describe, I mean, just team members, right? Like just saying, oh, this is my team member, you know, or people who are learning such and such skill. So, you know, people who are learning programming skills, or people who are learning, you know, SQL queries, or people with strong business skills. So instead of saying, you know, people who are learning, like, people, like, we really need somebody on the team who has strong business skills. And so being able to collaborate. And then even, you know, I would say don't call other people technical, but maybe people who feel less technical. Like, so saying we want to be an advocate for, you know, the people who feel less technical, and make sure that the work that we're doing feels accessible to them. And so really kind of the goal with this is to break down those silos, because, you know, people will also say, like, I'm not good with people. Like when I started kind of doing this exploration, I noticed that there were people who felt incredibly good with machines and would absolutely call themselves technical, but then they would say, oh, but I'm not good with people. Like, I don't have any social skills. And again, that's that zero-sum thinking. I don't have any social skills. You're standing here talking to me right now. What are you talking about? You don't have any social skills. And so I was just as kind of feeling like profoundly like that's not true to somebody else when they called themselves that, just like when I called myself non-technical. So I think it's just, non-technical is one of those words that has just kind of made its way into our corporate vernacular. And it's one of these things that maybe we don't think about, but recognizing the harm that it does, because what it does is, people complain about silos. That is the definition of a silo. It's saying you are either this or that. There's no gray area. There's no room for improvement. But being able to kind of break that down and say, you are technical. It might be a degree, right? But given the amount of resources, like you're a smart person, you can totally learn this. Here, I'll help you. That's how we start breaking down some of these corporate silos that everyone hates. So it's a small change, but I found that it's had profound impacts in my life and then also in the way that we work with our clients.
That's great. Super helpful. I always tend to describe myself as non-technical too, but I've worked in high tech for more than 30 years. So
yeah, isn't that interesting?
I've been asking a lot of questions. I want to make sure that we open up the questions to the audience as well. So if you audience members have questions for Andrea, you can pop them into the questions tab there, and we'll get to those in a couple of minutes. I mean, first I've got to ask about this tattoo. You have a tattoo of a JavaScript function on your wrist. What is it? What does it mean? Why is it there?
Yeah, so I got this, shortly after I had this kind of epiphany about being technical or non-technical, I started feeling more confident. And I was in a client meeting, and I was describing very technical terms like cyclomatic complexity and all these different things. And I felt like, okay, I've got this, I know what I'm talking about. And the client, potential client on the other side, he just stopped, and he kind of looked at me almost like I was a zoo animal, like trying to figure out kind of what to make of me. And he said, I'm sorry, I have to stop you right there. Do you code? And just again, the blatantness of this. And, I had been experiencing this for 6 years at conferences for, and now a client, I'm like, of course I code. This shouldn't have to be an uphill battle every time. And he goes, I know, you don't look like someone who codes. I think we're probably going to go with someone else. And just the explicitness of it, once I got in the elevator, I just kind of shook my head. I was like, I'm done. I was like, I need something to help me personally every time I encounter this kind of belief system. And also anytime I feel this myself. So the function here, in between parentheses, is what you put, you call it a parameter. And when you run this or call it, if you don't have anything in the parentheses, it comes back as undefined. So if you were to run this, it would say be undefined. And so when I look down at this tattoo, it's mostly for me. That's where I got it, where I did. It's like no one is going to tell me whether or not I'm technical or non-technical. Like, I'm the one who decides, and I'm the one who defines who I am. And, I'm not going to listen to those people. So I originally got it for me, but then I had the benefit of now when I go to reach out to someone's hand, no one asks me if I'm technical or non-technical anymore, because they see, oh, this girl's got a JavaScript function on her wrist. She probably knows how to code. And it's been amazing, the difference when, and I'm not saying everybody has to go out and get a tattoo, but for me, it's been great because then it's allowed me to fully stand in my presence and have those conversations that I wanted without getting shot down immediately with, a confidence deflation.
That's a fantastic story. So getting ready here to take questions from our audience. If you have a question, please enter it into the platform and we will get right to those. We have a first question here about gender. How does it play a role in how we unintentionally divide ourselves into silos?
Yeah, I think that gender does play a role. There was a really good episode on Planet Money, and then another one recently in the New York Times that talks about how women were really big in the computing world in the beginning, so like Ada Lovelace and Grace Hopper. But then in the mid-'80s, we stopped, and, there was gender parity. We were working towards it. Like, computer science was really good, and then the personal computer came out. And what happened, so I grew up in the 80s, and so the messages that I got were boys are the ones who create all of the technology, right? So if you think of like war games or the Wiz, like it's always the boy who's kind of front and center, and the girl is the sidekick at best, right? At best, she's the one who's like cheering the guy on, like, you can do it. At worst, she's objectified, right? So you think Weird Science, where it's like the whole reason they're doing this technology is to objectify a woman. So there's kind of definitely some cultural aspects that you have to break down. I know for me, when I started getting into this, I took a test on unconscious bias, and I found out that my bias was against women. Like, I had this belief system that, had accumulated over years and years of all of these different cultural things, and my mom worked at home, so I was like, oh, good women, stay at home. And, like, I was out there talking about women in the workplace, and intellectually I believed it, but deep down, that wasn't matching, and I didn't know that until I took that test. And then I was able to, once I recognized it, I was able to kind of decouple all these things and tear it apart. So I think a lot of it is just, it's unconscious. It's baked into our society. But the good thing is that there's a lot of forward progress. Just in the past 10 years, I have not been to a conference recently where there's been fewer than 20% women at the conference. And that's a big step up, but it's still not enough. But I do see more women speaking, more women on stage, and that's why I think, Bobbie, Innovation Women is so critical to actually changing that dynamic, because the more women we see on stage, the more we say, oh, I can do that. She looks like me,
That's great. So we have another question from the audience. How do you help a person who can be good at communicating but feels they have to be overly technical in order to sell technology services?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. I fell into this so much, especially early in my career. I felt like in order for me to make a point, I had to sound really smart, and I had to use all the jargon, and I had to use all of that. What I have discovered is, yes, you need to have a good understanding, but that you can oftentimes partner or pair with somebody, and there is a lot of value in being able to describe benefits of technology or benefit. I don't know if you're selling a product or so selling technology services. So what I found was that my skill was in metaphor. My skill was in telling stories. My skill was in describing the benefit and the value. And that is something that gets really missed. One of our biggest products came about where I was like, we just need to have a strategy document where we get all of the executives aligned on a product. And we're going to write this to the CFO who can understand why what we're selling is important. And I would say that if you're good at communicating, you probably do this without realizing it, and it's probably you can do it in your sleep. And this is something that the more analytical people on your team really, really struggle with. So my suggestion would be to pair and to ask why constantly, right? Like any, good journalist would. But to really uncover, what are those benefits and, what is the real reason that this is going to be so important? And then also listening and understanding kind of why your clients would need this and being able to relate and kind of abstract, the how you do it and things like that. Like I think I've found over the years that most people, especially clients and sales prospects, are absolutely fine with me saying, you know what, I'm going to get an engineer who's more experienced in that to make sure that they're answering your question correctly. But here's my overall sense, and here's the value and things like that. So, learning where, in the communication world you fit in, and then also, trying to learn more. So then that way it's, you're speaking from a place of truth and like knowledge rather than trying to sound smart.
Do you have specific practices that you suggest for getting business-minded people and technical people collaborating?
Yeah. So there's a couple of practices called pairing and mobbing, which basically just means collaborating, right? But what really transformed my ability to learn was when we started developing code as a group, and this is called mob programming. And, you can find the specifics about it. Woody Zuhl is the person who kind of pioneered this method, and he's got a book out there you can find online. But essentially what it is, you're working as a group, you're working as a team, and you rotate who's at the keyboard. And I found that for me, this was so, so important because I'm a strategic thinker. I like seeing kind of how different things come in play, and I really loved the process of observing people who knew what they were doing. I found it really, really challenging to, up-level my technical skills just by watching technical videos, which is kind of how a lot of the people on my team who are very introverted and, are comfortable with that learning style. For me, I really needed to be more collaborative. And the benefit there is that, there are often business things that come in that, questions that need to happen. So I was building a piece of software, and, the engineers were saying, oh, well, I don't know, we can get it down to the microsecond. We were dealing with timing stuff. And I was like, no, y'all, we only need it to run every 10 minutes. Like, you don't have to over-engineer it. And me just being there at the right moment and saying that it saved them probably 50 hours worth of work. So just recognizing that even if you're not saying a whole lot, that's the beauty of mobbing. And it gets people who are on the really thick engineering side, to learn more about the business, and you're all learning from each other. So yeah, mob programming is my favorite for that.
Oh, we've got another question from the audience. What advice would you give students in creative fields who are interested in working in tech?
Yeah, I think the best thing is to have a portfolio. I know this was something that I did when I was graduating from college and when I was out on my own as a consultant, but finding a way to kind of put your portfolio out there. There are a couple of really good projects out there. One is called Free Code Camp. And so what that does is it teaches you how to code. It is a 1,600-hour, it's the equivalent of getting a graduate degree. So you can get really, 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 really deep. This is where I learned a lot of my skills, and it's 100% free, and it's 100% online, so you don't have to, move to a different city to go to a boot camp or something like that. But one of the nice things about Free Code Camp is they put you, after you do some portfolio projects, they put you in, they'll pair you with a nonprofit that needs technical skills and needs, help. And so then you can use those projects as portfolio pieces. And I think also thinking in terms of more full stack. So, people sometimes think of themselves just as designers, right? And it's like, I don't want to do the code, I just want to do the visual stuff. But recognizing that that's so fluid these days. They're really, there's so much opportunity to do amazing visual stuff if you understand the code. And so just, there's courses, like I think there's one on LinkedIn, it's like, coding for visual thinkers, right? So just going out and just learning and exploring. There's a couple other resources that I used, especially early on. Like I started with like coding for kids. Like I Googled that and I was like, okay, how are kindergartners learning how to code? And so there's great stuff on like code.org, Khan Academy. There's a game called Code Combat. And so like thinking about things that are maybe non-traditional and, but then how do you use that and apply it to a project where then, you can apply your skills and kind of figuring out where do you love it? Where's your passion, right? And for example, if you're in fashion design, right, there's tons of stuff in like wearables and things like that. Like you can explore all of these different things, but the number one thing is recognizing that just because you're creative doesn't mean you can't also be technical. They're both the same, and vice versa. Just because you understand analytical stuff and logic really clearly doesn't mean that you're not also innovative and creative. So it's not either or.
Huh. What types of people in an organization should be involved in software?
Yeah, so you get kind of everyone. I think most people should consider themselves part of the technical group on some level, right? So we can think about, for example, customer service, right? Like being able to think programmatically and maybe building out response libraries like that, similar to what Scott had told me earlier, like you have technical skills, like you're using programmatic skills, but you're just doing it in a different way. Most companies have some kind of software that is running their system, that is running their business, and if that's you, then I would say that regardless of what your role is, learning more about the technology behind it and being able to collaborate with the people who are building it or learning more skills ends up being really good, because what we find is that for example, customer service, I'll stick with that one. If you have a repeating customer service problem, a lot of times that's because of an underlying cause in the software. And so if you have these two groups that are really distinct and not talking to each other, well, the poor customer service people are just going to be constantly answering the same questions and not using, their time as best they can. But being able to recognize patterns and say, okay, this is happening all the time. Maybe I can work with somebody on the technical side to actually address the underlying problem, and recognizing that, the customer service team might have the domain and, kind of the customer knowledge, but, the other person on an engineering team would have more of the technical knowledge. And that ability to collaborate and work together and have empathy for each other is so critical. Because that means that you can be more competitive. But I do think that kind of starts at the top. So, kind of getting as many people on board with the idea of like we are a technology company, or, or even if you're on a team, like getting everybody on your team to think about themselves in that way. So that can be useful.
Well, I think we've got time for maybe one more question here. What types of things prevent business-minded people and technical people from working well together?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's feeling like you're speaking different languages. I know for Scott, recognizing that there's just as much jargon and assumed knowledge in marketing communication as there is in kind of the more programming. So I know I would use terms like, a P&L, like a profit and loss statement, and I thought it was obvious, right? And Scott, after several years was like, I don't know what that means, right? He's like, he felt like every time I used that term, it kind of triggered his imposter syndrome and said, I don't really believe that I should be a business owner, right? Just like when he used a coding term. So I think part of it is just being aware of the jargon that we're using, and also being willing to say, hey, would you mind clarifying that? I don't quite understand that. Because what we think sometimes is that if we say that, we're going to look stupid. But oftentimes, it's the people who are humble and who admit what they don't know that are often seen as the most wise. And then they actually accumulate knowledge and they learn, as opposed to just glossing it over and going, oh my God, I feel so stupid, I don't know what that means. And also recognizing that goes on both sides. So
I always ask about jargon because, quite frankly, so many of the acronyms can mean so many different things.
Oh, I know. Well, it was funny. So when I was 25, I had this like lightning bolt of a mission statement, like a personal mission statement. And my personal mission is to rid the world of corporate babble. Like just all the jargon, all of it. I think it really prevents us all from working well together and actually getting progress done. So, yeah.
That is a very, very good mission. I heartily approve of that one. So we are going to be wrapping up for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrea. That was fantastic. I feel like we all learned a little bit of something about working together with the less technical folks and the more technical folks. And we are going to, as I said, have another Innovation Women Speak webinar on May 1st. I hope you'll join us on May 1st for that, and I believe there is a link on the platform. But you can also get information from Innovation Women and our website, and our Twitter account is WomenInno. And thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you in just a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.